I never thought a simple recipe could change the course of my life. My grandmother had always been the backbone of our family. She had hands that could knead dough so perfectly it almost felt alive, and a smile that could melt any tension in the room. But she was also fiercely private. Her kitchen was her sanctuary, and the recipe for her famous honey apple pie, the one that had been winning county fairs for decades, was the crown jewel of her secrets. I grew up watching her work. As a child, I was always underfoot, eager to help, yet never quite allowed to touch the most important parts. Grandma would glance at me, her sharp eyes twinkling, and say, "Patience, dear. One day it will all be yours to protect." At the time, I didn't understand. Protect? From whom? And now, sitting in the quiet of my own kitchen decades later, I finally began to understand. It all started last spring. I had retired from my career and moved back into the family home, the same one I had grown up in, nestled in a small town just outside of Chicago. The walls still smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla, reminders of Sunday afternoons when Grandma and I would bake side by side. My children were grown and scattered across the country, so the house was quiet, maybe too quiet. That's when I realized something had to give, and it was the perfect moment to try Grandma's recipe myself. I carefully unpacked her old handwritten cookbook. The edges yellowed, the ink smudged from years of flour-covered hands. My fingers trembled as I opened it to the honey apple pie page. There it was, Grandma's secret, handle with care. I chuckled softly. It sounded dramatic, but I had always known it was more than just pie. There was a method, a rhythm, an intuition that couldn't be written down. And now, for the first time in decades, it was my turn to bring it to life. As I started measuring the ingredients, I thought about Grandma. She had a way of making even the simplest task feel magical. The honey had to be local, sourced from the same apiary she had trusted for years. The apples had to be tart, crisp, and picked at just the right moment. No shortcuts. I followed her notes to the letter, even using the small, cast-iron skillet she had insisted I use. When the pie came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, I felt a sense of pride and fear I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just a dessert. It was a symbol of legacy. But little did I know, someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment. And when the news that my pie could sell for thousands of dollars started spreading in our small town, the whispers began. It started innocently enough, distant cousins asking to taste it, neighbors complimenting me on how much it tasted like Grandma's. But soon, there were offers, invitations, even casual hints of investment. "You should sell this," they said. People would pay a fortune for it. I laughed it off, thinking they were exaggerating. Who in their right mind would pay top dollar for an old family recipe? That's when my sister-in-law, Margaret, appeared at my door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret had always been ambitious, competitive, and subtle in her manipulations. She leaned against the doorway, peering at the pie on the counter. "I hear this little creation of yours is causing quite a stir," she said lightly. "Have you thought about sharing it more broadly?" I nodded politely, but something in her tone made my stomach tighten. She wasn't just making conversation. She was probing, testing, calculating. And in that moment, I remembered Grandma's warning about protection. Not of the recipe itself, but of what it could bring. Jealousy, greed, and betrayal. Things that could tear a family apart if left unchecked. As I watched Margaret leave, smiling too easily, I realized that my quiet retirement was over. The recipe had unlocked more than just the taste of nostalgia. It had unlocked the simmering tensions in our family, tensions I hadn't seen for years, and ones that would soon force me to fight in ways I never expected. Little did I know, within a week, someone would try to steal the secret that had kept Grandma's legacy alive for generations. And I would have to decide how far I was willing to go to protect it. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The aroma of brewed coffee mixed with faint cinnamon reminded me of countless mornings with Grandma, when the kitchen was filled with chatter, laughter, and love. But now, the silence felt heavier, as if it were hiding something. I decided to walk down to the small market in town. My neighbors were friendly, the kind who waved from across the street and chatted about weather, grandchildren, or church events. But even they had been whispering, just enough to make me feel that everyone knew about my honey apple pie. I tried to brush it off. I had nothing to prove, and I certainly didn't want attention. Yet by mid-morning, the first warning signs appeared. I received a call from my niece Lily, cheerful but slightly flustered. "Aunt Margie? Auntie, you've got to hear this. Uncle Tom was talking to Margaret and—" She hesitated. I could hear the caution in her voice, the way she was tiptoeing around my feelings. And it seems Margaret thinks she can. Get the recipe. My stomach dropped. Margaret, sly, calculating Margaret. I'd always known she was ambitious, but this? Trying to steal the recipe that had been a part of Grandma's heart and soul? I could feel Grandma's presence in that moment, like a whisper in the back of my mind. Protect it. Protect it at all costs. By the time I returned home, a strange sense of urgency had settled in. I went straight to the kitchen and inspected the recipe book. Nothing seemed out of place. Every page was intact, every note in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting. But I knew better than to assume safety. Margaret had already tasted my pride in that kitchen yesterday, and I had no doubt she would test me further. The day passed in a haze of phone calls and cautious glances. Every knock at the door, every unexpected ring, set my nerves on edge. Margaret hadn't yet made her move directly, but I could sense her planning something, scheming in her usual quiet, underhanded way. And that's when I decided I would not confront her openly. Grandma never had. She always believed in silent strength, and I would follow that wisdom. Late that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I took a seat at the kitchen table. I brewed myself a cup of tea and opened the recipe book again. I traced the lines of the honey apple pie instructions with my finger, remembering the days spent with Grandma. My heart ached with nostalgia, but also burned with resolve. Whoever thought they could steal what Grandma entrusted to me had another thing coming. I began jotting down notes, not just for baking, but for a plan. If Margaret wanted the recipe, she would have to earn it. She would not get it through charm, manipulation, or deceit. Every family conflict has its signs, its moments of tension that reveal the true character of those involved. Margaret was showing hers, and I intended to respond in kind, quietly, strategically, and deliberately. A week passed, and my suspicions were confirmed. One evening, I found an unfamiliar package on my porch. It was wrapped carelessly with no return address. Inside was a letter, scrawled in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. "I hope you're ready to share. Everyone deserves a taste of the pie. After all, family is family, isn't it?" I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Family is family? Margaret had no understanding of what family truly meant. Grandma's secret wasn't just about a pie. It was about trust, love, and integrity, and here was someone trying to manipulate that for personal gain. I made my decision then. I would let her think she was in control while quietly preparing my counter. I wasn't about to make the mistake of underestimating her cunning. Grandma had taught me patience, observation, and strategy. She had shown me how to use silence as a weapon, and that's exactly what I intended to do. The next morning, I baked another batch of pies, just as perfect, just as golden, just as irresistible as the first. But this time I did something different. I wrapped one pie carefully, then set it on the front porch with a note. For those who underestimate the power of patience, I knew Margaret would see it. I knew she would be tempted. And I would be ready to watch, learn, and strike, not with rage, but with the quiet, calculated precision Grandma had always praised. The first betrayal had arrived, and I realized that the recipe, once a symbol of comfort and joy, had become a weapon, a means to reveal the true colors of those around me. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the silent game of revenge had begun, and in the weeks to come, she would make moves that would shock the family, testing my resolve, patience, and cunning in ways I could never have imagined. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, my mind already racing through possibilities. Margaret's letter still lingered in my thoughts, its veiled threat refusing to leave me. Somehow she had to be tested. I had to know the lengths she would go to. Grandma had always said, "The true measure of a person shows when temptation is placed before them." I now understood the depth of her wisdom. The pie I had left on the porch the night before was gone. Not a crumb remained. No note, no explanation. Only a faint impression that someone had taken it carefully, almost reverently. But I knew better. Margaret was cunning. She wouldn't simply take it to eat. This was reconnaissance. A challenge. I spent the day quietly observing, pretending to go about my normal routines, watering plants, organizing the pantry, and even dusting the living room shelves. But my ears were always attuned to the faintest sound, every creak of the floorboards, every neighbor's whisper. By late afternoon, my patience was rewarded. Margaret appeared, dressed in her usual polished attire, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She lingered near the driveway, peering through the window as if searching for clues, trying to gauge my next move. I didn't confront her. I didn't need to. I simply smiled to myself, sipping my tea as I watched her maneuver like a predator circling prey. She didn't know that I had anticipated her every step. Grandma had taught me to use the mind as a weapon, and in this quiet duel, I held the advantage. By evening, Margaret's audacity escalated. She invited herself over under the pretense of family bonding. "I thought we could have a small tea together," she said, voice honeyed, eyes glinting with something I could only describe as ambition wrapped in false warmth. "I want to hear more about your little success with Grandma's pie." I agreed, of course. There was no point in outright denial. Suspicion often dies when masked by hospitality. I led her into the kitchen, brewed tea, and offered a slice of pie. The second batch I had baked, carefully guarding the most critical part of Grandma's secret, the unique honey blend. I let her taste it, watching her face as she savored every bite. Her eyes lit up, but I noticed the rapid flicker of calculation behind the smile. She was trying to reverse engineer it. "Delicious as always," she said, voice dripping sweetness. "You've really captured Grandma's magic," I smiled, nodding. "It's all in the technique. Years of practice." She lingered, asking questions about ingredients, timing, even the thickness of the crust. I answered vaguely, never revealing the part that made the pie so special. I noticed the subtle frustration beginning to show in her demeanor, the slight tapping of her foot, the way her fingers fidgeted on the tablecloth. I allowed myself a quiet triumph. The trap was set. Margaret's boldness didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I began receiving anonymous texts on my phone, hints, suggestions, even thinly veiled threats. Someone had clearly tried to reach out, testing my defenses, gauging whether I was vulnerable. I kept calm. Grandma's philosophy had always been, never show your hand too early. I would wait, watch, and act only when the time was right. The quiet tension in the household was palpable. My children, visiting briefly, noticed the strain. "Mom, what's going on with Aunt Margaret?" my daughter asked, brow furrowed. I only shrugged, masking my concern behind a calm smile. Family dynamics were tricky. Too much disclosure could tip the scales. I needed to handle this delicately, with the finesse Grandma had always admired. Then came the moment I had been anticipating. Margaret decided to escalate. One morning, I found a note slipped under the kitchen door. It read, "I know you're hiding something. Don't think you can keep it from me. I'll find the secret, and when I do, the world will see who truly deserves it." Her threat was blatant now. There was no more pretending, no more subtlety. Margaret had crossed the line, and it was time to respond, not with anger but with strategy. I began to plan a series of subtle countermeasures. First, I would control the narrative around the recipe. I contacted a local bakery I trusted, one that had long admired Grandma's pie, and arranged for them to promote a small batch under my guidance. Carefully, I ensured that only a select few knew the true secret ingredient, the same way Grandma would have done it. Meanwhile, I started documenting every interaction with Margaret. Notes, photos, even small receipts. All would serve as a record should this escalate into legal or public matters. My resolve hardened. Margaret would learn the hard way that Grandma's legacy wasn't something to manipulate or steal. By nightfall, I sat at the kitchen table again, reflecting on the events of the week. The pie had become more than a dessert. It was a symbol of legacy, a test of character, and now, a tool for justice. I realized that my journey wasn't merely about protecting a recipe. It was about safeguarding the values and integrity that Grandma had instilled in me. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Margaret would strike again, more boldly, more cunningly. But I was ready. Silent, patient, and vigilant. I would defend what was mine, honor what Grandma had built, and expose the true nature of those who dared to betray family trust. The first wave of confrontation had passed, but the war was only beginning. And I, armed with patience and strategy, was prepared for every move Margaret would make next. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I first noticed something was off. The sun streamed gently through the kitchen window, painting the familiar countertops with warm light, yet the calm I usually felt in these moments was gone. My mind was uneasy, anticipating Margaret's next move, because after the bold tea visit and the anonymous notes, I knew she would not relent. I heard a faint knock at the door. At first, I assumed it was just a neighbor or the mailman. But when I opened it, I was met with a familiar face I hadn't expected. My brother, Peter. His expression was serious, almost anxious, and the look in his eyes made my stomach twist. "Hey, sis," he said, voice low. "We need to talk. It's about Margaret. And the recipe." I stepped aside and gestured him in, offering tea. Peter had always been mild-mannered, the kind who avoided conflict whenever possible. If he had come to me, it meant things had gone further than I realized. "Margaret's not acting alone," he confessed as we sat at the kitchen table. "She's been talking to Uncle Tom about the recipe and, well, it seems she's trying to get him on her side. She wants full access and he's tempted." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Uncle Tom, my own brother-in-law, who had always seemed kind but had a history of envy, might betray our family trust. The thought of him siding with Margaret made my blood run cold. Grandma's warning echoed in my mind. Some battles are fought within the family, not outside it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Has he given her anything?" I asked cautiously, hoping against hope that the answer would be no. Peter shook his head. "Not yet. But he's been softening. He thinks if he helps Margaret, he might get recognition, maybe even a share of the profits. He doesn't understand the stakes." I clenched my fists under the table, trying not to show my anger. Betrayal in the family was far more painful than anything from outsiders. And yet I realized this also gave me an opportunity. If I could turn Uncle Tom's curiosity into an advantage, I might be able to expose Margaret's true intentions without direct confrontation. I spent the afternoon carefully planning my next moves. I would continue baking as usual, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But this time, I would leave subtle clues, just enough to lure both Margaret and Uncle Tom into revealing their plans. It was a delicate dance. One misstep and the entire family could fracture. Later that evening, Margaret appeared again, unannounced, this time with a smile that was far too bright. "I was hoping to catch you alone," she said, stepping into the kitchen. "I heard Uncle Tom might know a thing or two about your little success." "Isn't that right?" I kept my expression calm, pouring tea with deliberate slowness. "Peter was just over earlier. He's concerned about the recipe falling into the wrong hands." I let the words hang in the air, carefully placing doubt in her mind. Margaret's smile faltered for a split second, and I knew she realized her plan might be compromised. But she quickly recovered, leaning closer. "I just want to help the family prosper. Surely you don't want to hoard Grandma's gift." Her words were dripping with false sincerity, and I could almost hear the gears turning behind those calculating eyes. I poured another cup of tea, careful not to spill a drop, and simply said, "Prosperity built on betrayal isn't prosperity at all." For the next few days, I noticed subtle shifts in behavior. Uncle Tom seemed torn, eager for recognition, but wary of Margaret's manipulation. Margaret, on the other hand, grew impatient. She began leaving small, pointed messages, emails, calls, even texts that suggested she was closer than she really was. I realized it was time to escalate my silent strategy. I invited Peter to help me bake another batch of pies. Together, we worked meticulously, but I added a twist, a small, deliberate variation that only someone with true knowledge of Grandma's secret could replicate. Then, I left the pies on the porch once more. Margaret would see them, no doubt, but this time the pies were bait. Anyone attempting to reverse engineer the recipe would fail. And if Uncle Tom made the wrong move, the evidence would be clear. That night, I watched from the kitchen window. Margaret approached the porch, her movements cautious, almost ritualistic. She examined the pies, then reached for one, only to hesitate as if sensing something amiss. I smiled faintly to myself. The trap had been set. What I didn't anticipate was the twist. Uncle Tom had followed her. From the shadows, he observed, conflicted and nervous. I realized that his involvement could either expose Margaret completely or create new chaos. But one thing was certain. The family secret was now a weapon in my hands, and I would use it carefully, strategically, and silently, just as Grandma had taught me. As I closed the curtains, I felt the weight of the situation settle over me. The hidden ally in Peter and was now aware of the stakes. Margaret's audacity had grown, but so had my resolve. The game had escalated to a new level, and the next moves would determine who in the family could be trusted, and who would ultimately pay for their greed. The first wave of betrayal had evolved into a full-blown test of loyalty, cunning, and patience. And I knew deep down the next week would bring revelations that none of us could have predicted. The days following the porch pie incident were tense. Every knock at the door, every unexpected call, felt like an ambush. I kept my routine, but my senses were sharper than ever. Margaret's patience was thinning, and I knew she was planning something bolder. She wouldn't wait forever. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, rolling dough for another batch, when the doorbell rang insistently. Peering through the window, I saw Margaret, drenched from the downpour, holding a basket tightly against her chest. Her forced smile and soaking hair only made her look more determined, more desperate. "I thought I'd bring a little help," she said as I opened the door. "Some ingredients I thought you might be missing. And maybe we can discuss the recipe?" I gestured for her to come in, pouring a cup of tea as I did. I noticed she placed the basket carefully on the counter, and my heart sank slightly. Inside were unusual ingredients, rare spices and exotic fruits I'd never used before. Clearly, she had done her research, trying to imitate or improve Grandma's recipe. I nodded politely, keeping my expression neutral. "Thank you for thinking of me," I said, examining the basket. "These are interesting additions." Her eyes sparkled, but there was something dangerous behind the glimmer. She was testing me, trying to provoke a reaction. And I wasn't about to give her one. Grandma's lessons were clear. Never let greed dictate your emotions. Margaret began asking questions, pushing boundaries, subtly implying she had inside information. "You know, some people think the secret isn't just the ingredients. Maybe it's the process, the timing, the magic touch," she said, leaning closer. I smiled softly, nodding. "Yes, the magic touch takes years to perfect." I allowed the words to hang, knowing she would interpret them as a challenge. Then came the reckless move I had been anticipating. Margaret, frustrated with subtlety, decided to act. While I stepped into the pantry to retrieve a measuring cup, I heard the soft click of the kitchen cabinet door. I turned quickly, just in time to see her fingers brushing against my grandmother's recipe book. My heart raced, but I kept calm. "Margaret," I said, my voice steady but firm, "I wouldn't touch that if I were you." She froze, caught in the act, and for a moment her face showed genuine fear. But it quickly shifted back to defiance. "I just wanted to see," she said, almost too casually. "Curiosity is harmless, isn't it?" I stepped closer, blocking her access. "Curiosity can be dangerous, especially when it threatens what's important to your family. That book represents more than a recipe. It represents trust, legacy, and integrity. Do not underestimate it, Ash or me. Margaret's forced smile faltered, but her mind was already spinning. She realized the risk of being caught in the act. Yet her desperation had pushed her to test boundaries. That reckless move revealed everything I needed to know. She was willing to break family bonds for her ambition. Later that evening, I called Peter to discuss the event. She touched the book, I told him. And she didn't care about consequences. Peter frowned. We need to be careful. If she escalates, Uncle Tom might finally tip the balance. He's still hesitant, but he's watching her closely. I sighed. Family betrayal was far more painful than anything an outsider could attempt. And yet, it also offered the opportunity for justice. Margaret had exposed her intentions, her recklessness, and her impatience. Now, I could plan my next move with precision. I decided to turn her boldness into an advantage. The next day, I baked yet another batch of pies, this time embedding subtle markers only I and Peter would recognize. Every slice left on the porch, every pie shared with trusted friends, would serve as both protection and proof. Should Margaret attempt to claim the recipe or manipulate Uncle Tom, the evidence would be undeniable. By nightfall, I reflected on how Grandma's simple honey apple pie had escalated into a silent war of cunning, patience, and strategy. What began as a cherished family tradition had now become a test of character, morality, and loyalty. Margaret had made the first reckless move, and I knew more were coming. But with careful observation, subtle preparation, and strategic thinking, I felt ready. The pie had become more than food. It was a symbol, a tool, and a shield. And as Margaret's impatience grew, so would her exposure. The next week promised new confrontations, unexpected alliances, and shocking revelations that would ripple through the family. I sat in the kitchen that night, sipping my tea, reflecting on the events. Grandma's lessons echoed patience, observation, and subtlety. These are the tools of those who defend what matters most. I realized that the battle over the recipe was no longer just about food or profit. It was about trust, legacy, and the true nature of family. Margaret's reckless move had given me the upper hand, and I would use it wisely. The next wave of confrontation would test every ounce of strategy, patience, and courage I possessed. And when it came, she would see that Grandma's legacy wasn't something to be stolen, it was something to be honored. The week after Margaret's reckless move passed in a tense blur. Every day I could feel her eyes on me, even when she wasn't in the room. The small markers I had embedded in the latest batch of pies had given me a sense of security, but the tension in the house was thick, almost tangible. I knew Margaret was plotting again, and I had to stay 3 steps ahead. It started with subtle conversations, whispers I could hear through the walls, snippets of phone calls cut short when I entered a room. Then came the most unsettling moment. Uncle Tom, my once neutral brother-in-law, approached me one evening in the kitchen. His hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes betrayed a mix of guilt and fear. I don't know what to do, he admitted, lowering his voice. Margaret's relentless. She's trying to manipulate everyone, even Peter. I can't ignore her anymore. I studied him carefully. His wavering loyalty could either become my greatest asset or my worst nightmare. Tom, I said gently, what you do now will determine where you stand in this family. Margaret has revealed her true nature. Are you willing to be part of it? He swallowed hard, nodding slightly. I want to do the right thing. But I don't want to lose her either. I sighed. Family loyalty was complicated, especially when greed and ambition were involved. Then listen carefully, I said. We need a plan. Margaret thinks she's in control, but she underestimates how much I've prepared. Every pie, every interaction, every move I make is deliberate. You need to be careful, Tom. Choose wisely where your loyalty lies. While Tom wrestled with his conscience, Margaret's schemes escalated. She began hosting small gatherings, using charm and flattery to sway family members. Invitations arrived at our door, each one designed to make me appear secretive or paranoid. It was a subtle form of manipulation, and I had to counter it carefully. I enlisted Peter's help more directly. Together, we baked another batch of pies, this time incorporating an extra layer of complexity, subtle differences in taste and texture that only we could recognize. Each pie was a silent signal, a breadcrumb trail to identify anyone attempting to uncover the secret improperly. One evening, during a town social event, Margaret made her boldest move yet. She approached Uncle Tom in front of several family friends, whispering so no one else could hear, but just loud enough for me to catch fragments. "If we work together," she said, "we could share in the fortune. No one has to know. Think of what we could gain." I felt a chill run down my spine. Her audacity was staggering. But I remained calm, observing from a distance. This was the moment I had been preparing for. Proof of intent. I knew what I had to do. Back at home, I carefully documented the encounter, noting time, location, and witnesses. Evidence was building. Margaret's actions were no longer subtle. They were reckless. And this time, there would be no room for her manipulations to succeed. That night, I spoke with Peter and Tom together. "Margaret is overplaying her hand," I said. "If she continues down this path, it will become clear to everyone where her loyalties lie. But we need to be smart. We can't let anger or fear control us. We have to act strategically, just as Grandma would have." Tom nodded, finally showing signs of clarity. "I see now," he admitted. "I've been blinded by her charm, but I can't ignore what she's doing. I'm with you." With our alliance solidified, I felt a cautious sense of relief. Margaret had made a mistake, underestimating the loyalty and cunning of those she thought she could manipulate. But the storm wasn't over. The next morning, I discovered a shocking twist. One of the pies I had left for a trusted friend had disappeared. Not stolen carelessly, but deliberately. The crumbs were gone, the wrapper removed. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. My heart raced. Margaret had escalated beyond expectation, or perhaps there was another hidden player I hadn't yet accounted for. Either way, the stakes had risen dramatically. I knew then that the battle for Grandma's secret recipe was no longer just about pies. It was about trust, family, and survival. Every move now required precision, patience, and an unwavering resolve. One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and Margaret's schemes could succeed. As I sat alone that evening, reflecting on the week's events, I realized the true lesson Grandma had passed down. It wasn't just about baking a perfect pie or protecting a recipe. It was about understanding human nature, predicting ambition, and defending what mattered most with silent strength. And as I prepared for the next round of this family battle, I knew one thing for certain. Margaret's next move would be daring, desperate, and dangerous, and I had to be ready to meet it head on. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Margaret made her boldest move yet. I had been cautiously preparing my latest batch of pies, each one a silent statement of strategy, when I received a frantic call from Peter. "Margie, you need to come to the community hall. Now," he urged. "Margaret, she's doing something." I grabbed my coat and rushed out, my mind racing with possibilities. The community hall was bustling with familiar faces, neighbors, and family friends who had gathered for the local bake-off, an annual tradition where everyone brought their best desserts. It was Margaret's opportunity, the perfect stage for a public spectacle. When I arrived, I saw her standing near the display table, a confident smile plastered across her face. Around her were pies, cakes, and pastries, all perfectly arranged. But one particular tray caught my attention, a replica of Grandma's honey apple pie, meticulously crafted to mimic mine. Her hands were poised dramatically as she spoke to the crowd, boasting about her newly discovered family recipe and hinting at the potential fortune it could bring. My blood ran cold. She was attempting to claim the recipe publicly, using the community's admiration as leverage. But I stayed calm. I knew Margaret's bravado would be her undoing. Peter and I moved closer, keeping our voices low. "She's reckless," Peter whispered. "Do we intervene now?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Let her make the first mistake. Watch, observe." The evidence will be hers to expose, Margaret continued, weaving a story of discovery, exaggerating her role in the family's culinary success. I stumbled upon this amazing recipe, she said, addressing the crowd, and I realized it could be the next big thing. Imagine a pie that could bring happiness and prosperity. The audience murmured, impressed by her confidence. But as she gestured to the pie, she failed to notice the subtle differences I had embedded in my batch. Differences only Peter and I could recognize. Anyone attempting to duplicate the recipe without that knowledge would inevitably fail. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. One of the older neighbors, Mrs. Caldwell, approached Margaret and took a bite. Her expression shifted instantly from polite curiosity to confusion. This doesn't taste right," she said, frowning. "It's similar, yes, but something is off. What exactly did you put in this?" Margaret's smile faltered. She hesitated, searching for words. "Oh, well, I might have added a few personal touches," she stammered. The whispering began. The crowd noticed her uncertainty, and I could see the cracks forming in her confident facade. Margaret's public attempt to claim the recipe was unraveling before everyone's eyes. I stepped forward calmly, holding a small sample plate with a slice from my original batch. "Friends, neighbors, everyone," I said, my voice steady. "This pie is the one that has been in our family for generations. It's Grandma's recipe, passed down with love and care. The differences you taste are not mistakes. They are part of the legacy." Gasps and murmurs spread through the hall. People compared the pies, recognizing the subtle perfection in my version. Margaret's expression twisted with frustration and embarrassment. She had underestimated the importance of authenticity and trust. Then, in a shocking twist, Uncle Tom stepped forward. "Margaret," he said, voice firm and unwavering, "I've been part of this family for years, and I cannot let you misrepresent what's ours. This recipe is not yours to claim. I support keeping it in the family where it belongs." The room went silent. Margaret's bravado faltered completely, replaced with anger and disbelief. She had expected allies, admiration, perhaps even envy. Instead, she faced exposure and public accountability. I felt a surge of relief. This was the moment Grandma had warned me about, when temptation and greed reveal true character. Margaret had made her move, and it had backfired spectacularly. Later that evening, back at home, I reflected on the events. Margaret's daring attempt had tested the family's unity, and in the process, it had solidified my position as the keeper of Grandma's legacy. Peter and Uncle Tom had proven their loyalty, and the importance of patience and observation was clearer than ever. I knew the war was not over. Margaret's pride would not allow her to retreat quietly. But she had made a critical mistake, exposing her intentions publicly. This gave me the upper hand, and from here on, every move would be mine to orchestrate. The first wave of public confrontation had ended, but the silent game of strategy, revenge, and protection was far from finished. Margaret would regroup, plot, and perhaps even strike again. But now I had evidence, allies, and the moral high ground. The battle for Grandma's secret recipe had entered its most crucial phase, one where cunning, patience, and subtlety would determine the outcome. And as I cleaned up the kitchen that night, savoring the quiet after the storm, I realized one truth. No amount of ambition, manipulation, or audacity could ever surpass the power of legacy, love, and careful strategy. The morning after Margaret's public humiliation, I woke with a sense of uneasy calm. The bake-off had revealed her audacity, but I knew better than to think the storm had passed. People like Margaret didn't retreat quietly. They plotted, they lingered in the shadows, and they struck when you least expected it. Peter and I agreed to stay vigilant, but even so, nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It started subtly. Small things out of place in the kitchen, a faint disturbance in the pantry, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. At first, I chalked it up to Peter or myself moving items while preparing for the next batch of pies. But then I noticed something unmistakable. The special honey jar, the one I had reserved for the secret recipe, had been tampered with. My heart sank. Margaret had struck behind the scenes. She hadn't confronted me publicly this time. She had chosen the quiet, personal approach, trying to undermine my work without anyone knowing. This was a new level of audacity. I immediately called Peter. "She's in the house," I whispered, trying to keep my voice low. "She's testing boundaries, looking for an opening." Peter arrived quickly, moving cautiously through the house with me. We searched every corner, checking windows, doors, and even the porch. There was no sign of Margaret, yet the evidence of her interference was clear. Whoever entered had left traces, subtle fingerprints and small smudges on the counter. I realized that Margaret's covert strike was more than just an attempt to access the recipe. It was a psychological tactic. She wanted to unsettle me, to make me question my security and my control. And for a brief moment it worked. I felt a pang of vulnerability I hadn't felt since the first letter arrived. But I quickly reminded myself of Grandma's wisdom. Observe, don't react. Strength lies in patience and careful planning. I would not let fear dictate my actions. Instead, I turned the situation into an opportunity. That afternoon, I baked another batch of pies, deliberately leaving subtle markers, different from the previous batch, in places Margaret would likely target. Each pie was a silent test, a trap to catch her in the act. Peter helped, and we documented everything meticulously, noting the placement of ingredients, the exact measurements, and even the order in which each pie was arranged. As evening approached, the tension grew unbearable. I sat by the window watching the street outside, waiting, and then I saw her, Margaret sneaking along the side of the house, moving cautiously as if expecting to be caught. My pulse quickened. She had returned, confident yet careful, unaware that Peter and I were watching every move. We waited until she reached the porch, and then we struck. I opened the door calmly, blocking her exit. "Margaret," I said softly, but with authority, "you're playing a dangerous game." Her eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly masked it with a defiant smile. "I'm just curious," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. "I see," I replied. "Curiosity can be harmless. Until it crosses a line, and you've crossed several." I gestured to the pies on the porch, each one marked and documented. "Everything you attempt, everything you touch is being observed. You cannot act without consequence." Her defiance faltered for a moment, replaced by anger and frustration. She realized that her covert strikes had not gone unnoticed, and that I had turned her tactics against her. In that moment, I understood the depth of the conflict. Margaret was relentless, but I had the advantage. Patience, preparation, and a network of loyal family members who valued integrity over ambition. Uncle Tom had already pledged his loyalty, and Peter stood beside me, ready to act if necessary. The evening ended with Margaret retreating, her plans foiled, but the threat remained. She would not give up, I knew that. Her next move would be more cunning, more dangerous, and perhaps even personal. But I felt a quiet confidence. I had learned from Grandma, and I was ready. Sitting in the kitchen that night, reflecting on the events, I realized that the recipe had become more than a cherished family tradition. It was a symbol of resilience, a measure of character, and a test of loyalty. Margaret's covert strike had shown her true nature: ambitious, reckless, and willing to cross lines for personal gain. But the story wasn't over. The next chapter would bring even greater challenges, testing my resolve and the bonds of family. And when it came, I would be ready to protect what Grandma had entrusted to me, silently, strategically, and with unwavering determination. The week after Margaret's covert strike was the most unnerving yet. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. I double-checked the kitchen, the pantry, even the locked cabinet where Grandma's recipe book was kept. Yet, Margaret's presence lingered like a shadow, always watching, always plotting. It wasn't until midweek that I realized the depth of her recklessness. My youngest granddaughter, Emma, had been helping me in the kitchen, measuring sugar and humming Grandma's old tunes. I had trusted her to follow instructions carefully, but when I turned to retrieve the honey jar, it was missing. Panic surged through me. "Emma! Where's the honey?" I demanded, my voice sharp but controlled. I don't know," she stammered, wide-eyed. "I just set it on the counter like you told me." Something in her voice told me the truth. She hadn't moved it. That left only one possibility. Margaret had returned. I called Peter immediately. "She's escalating. This time she's putting the kids at risk, even if unintentionally." "We need to act." Peter arrived within minutes, his expression grim. Together, we traced Emma's steps and examined the kitchen carefully. That's when we found it. The honey jar had been subtly replaced with a nearly identical container, one laced with a slight alteration that would ruin the recipe if used. Margaret had taken the real honey, intending to replicate the recipe perfectly elsewhere. My heart sank. This wasn't just theft. It was a personal attack, an attempt to undermine my family and disrupt the legacy Grandma had left behind. Margaret had crossed a line I hadn't anticipated. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Grandma had always said, "When someone targets what you love most, respond with patience and precision, not anger." I had learned that lesson well over the past weeks, but seeing Margaret's audacity firsthand, targeting a child, stirred a different kind of resolve. We carefully restored the honey to its rightful place, ensuring Emma wouldn't touch it again unsupervised. Then Peter and I devised a plan. If Margaret wanted to play personal games, we would catch her red-handed and make it undeniable to everyone in the family. That evening, Margaret showed up at the front door once again, pretending to be cheerful and friendly. "I thought I'd check in," she said, voice honeyed, eyes darting nervously. "Just wanted to see how everyone's doing." I invited her in, keeping calm, while Peter discreetly documented her every movement. I could see the faint tension in her body, the way her hands fidgeted, the slight hesitation before she spoke. Margaret had overplayed her hand, and now she had to act carefully. We allowed her to roam the kitchen, subtly watching which areas she gravitated toward. My eyes never left her, and Peter kept a silent record. Every gesture, every glance, every word she uttered could be used as evidence of her intentions. Then it happened. Margaret reached for the counter, the exact spot where the real honey jar had been placed. Peter gently blocked her hand, but she pulled back quickly, her face a mask of innocence. "Oh, I was just curious about the arrangement," she said, voice tight. I smiled softly. Curiosity is natural, but some things are meant to be respected, and some lines are not meant to be crossed. Her defiance was there, but now tempered by the knowledge that we were watching. Margaret's personal strike had failed, not because she lacked skill, but because she underestimated our vigilance, our patience, and the silent strength of a family united. After she left, I turned to Peter, relief and determination mingling in my heart. "She's relentless," I said, "but she's also predictable when desperate. Her next move will be more daring, but she won't succeed. Not if we continue to act carefully." I reflected that night on what had happened. Margaret had taken the battle from public humiliation to personal attack, trying to unsettle the family by targeting Emma. But it had only strengthened our resolve. My family, once divided by her manipulation and greed, was now solidified by trust, loyalty, and shared vigilance. The recipe, once simply a treasured heirloom, had become a symbol of resilience, strategy, and unity. Margaret had shown her true nature, reckless, manipulative, and dangerously ambitious. But in doing so, she had revealed all her weaknesses. The final phase of this battle was approaching. Margaret would not stop until she either succeeded or was completely exposed. And now, with evidence, vigilance, and strategic planning, I was prepared to protect Grandma's legacy and my family at every turn. It all came to a head one stormy evening. The wind howled outside, rattling windows, as though nature itself was warning us of what was to come. Margaret, desperate and reckless, had made her boldest attempt yet. She had organized a small gathering at our home under the pretense of family reconciliation, but everyone knew better. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Peter and I prepared quietly, ensuring every precaution was in place. The honey and the secret ingredients were securely stored, and every pie for the gathering was carefully monitored. Grandma's recipe was safe, but the real battle was about to unfold. A battle not of ingredients, but of truth, cunning, and character. Margaret arrived, radiant with a false warmth, her eyes glinting with ambition and mischief. "I thought it was time to clear the air," she said, voice sweet but sharp. "We're family. Surely we can all share in the success of Grandma's legacy." I smiled, letting her words settle over the room, allowing the tension to build. "Family," I said slowly, "isn't about ambition or greed. It's about trust, love, and respect, things you've consistently ignored." Her smile faltered slightly, though she tried to maintain composure. "Now, Margie," Peter whispered, "let's show her something she'll never forget." I nodded, signaling him. Together, we revealed the subtle markers and traps in the latest batch of pies. The same markers Margaret had attempted to steal or replicate in previous attempts. Every slice told a story: her interference, her deception, and her failed attempts to undermine our family. Margaret's face went pale. The realization hit her like a hammer. Every move she had made, every sly attempt to steal the recipe or manipulate the family, had been documented, anticipated, and countered. Her pride, ambition, and desperation had built a trap she could not escape. You set me up," she gasped, eyes wide, voice trembling with fury and disbelief. I stepped closer, my voice calm but unwavering. "No, Margaret. You set yourself up. Every action, every deception, every reckless move was your own doing. You underestimated patience, strategy, and the strength of a family united. Then came the final twist, the moment that would leave everyone stunned. Uncle Tom, who had wavered so long between loyalty and ambition, stood tall beside me. "I promised myself I wouldn't be swayed by charm or greed," he said, looking Margaret directly in the eye. "And I've kept that promise. The recipe stays with those who honor it, and that is my family, not you." Margaret's shoulders slumped, her defiance collapsing under the weight of truth and exposure. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, to manipulate, but no words could undo the evidence, the witnesses, or the bonds that had been solidified by this ordeal. Peter added, softly but firmly, "Your attempts to manipulate, to deceive, and even to target Emma crossed lines no one should cross. This ends tonight." Margaret's expression shifted from defiance to despair, and then to a reluctant acknowledgement of defeat. The gathering, once meant to showcase her ambition, became the stage of her own public unraveling. In the quiet that followed, I realized the depth of what had happened. Grandma's secret recipe, once simply a treasured family tradition, had become a symbol of loyalty, patience, and the resilience of those who honor family bonds. Margaret had tested us, pushed boundaries, and revealed her true character, but in doing so, she had strengthened our unity and resolve. I looked around at my family. Peter, steadfast and supportive. Uncle Tom, redeemed and loyal. Emma, safe and unaware of how close she had been to danger. And I understood deeply that the true legacy was not the pie itself, but the lessons Grandma had imparted: integrity, vigilance, and love. Margaret finally left that night. Quietly, her schemes thwarted, her ambitions exposed, and her place in the family irrevocably altered. She would not return, at least not in the way she had once imagined. The storm outside began to subside, leaving a sense of calm and closure. Sitting in the kitchen, savoring a warm slice of Grandma's original honey apple pie, I reflected on everything that had transpired. The weeks of deception, tension, and betrayal had tested me in ways I could never have imagined. But through strategy, patience, and unity, we had prevailed. Grandma's words echoed in my mind one last time. True strength is not in fury, but in patience. Not in ambition, but in loyalty. And not in secrecy, but in honoring what is sacred. I realized that the greatest victory was not in protecting a recipe, but in preserving the integrity of a family. Margaret had tried to steal more than a pie. She had tried to manipulate hearts and loyalties. And in the end, she had failed. Not because we fought harder, but because we stood together, guided by love, strategy, and the unshakable bond of family. As I cleaned up the kitchen, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The pies were safe, the family was whole, and Grandma's legacy remained intact. And though the echoes of betrayal would always linger in memory, the story would be told not as one of loss, but as a testament to resilience, cunning, and the enduring power of family. Grandma's secret recipe had survived, and so had we.